A terrified little girl dialed 911, whispering, "My dad hurt me." Moments later, the police knocked on her door, but what unfolded next left everyone speechless. Lisa sat motionless in her tiny, dimly lit room. Her frail frame seemed to disappear into the shadows, save for her trembling hands clutching a faded photograph. It was the only thing left of her mother and younger brother, a relic of happier times now lost. Her face, pale and streaked with tears. Her swollen eyes gazed at the photo as if it might whisper a solution to her torment. Her chest ached, not just from the physical pain of the latest bruise, but from the suffocating loneliness. With a shaky breath, she picked up the outdated phone, its buttons worn smooth from years of use. Dialing 911 felt like climbing a mountain, but she forced her trembling fingers to complete the task. 911, what's your emergency? It was the voice of a woman, gentle but firm, the kind Lisa had longed to hear for so many years. My dad, Lisa stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Tears came unbidden, choking her words. He hurts me. My chest. It hurts. The woman's tone shifted slightly, a mix of concern and urgency. Sweetheart, where are you right now? Is he with you? Lisa opened her mouth to reply, but the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open froze her in place. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, followed by a familiar voice calling her name. Panic gripped her chest like a vice. She quickly ended the call and shoved the phone beneath her pillow. The door to her room opened just enough for Zayden's imposing frame to fill the space. His sharp eyes scanned her like a predator assessing prey. Chloe appeared behind him, her hands burdened with grocery bags, her expression one of quiet detachment. "What are you doing?" Zayden's voice was calm, but there was a razor's edge to it. Lisa shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "Nothing," she mumbled, her fingers tightening around the photo. Zayden said nothing more, but the tension in the room lingered, even after he and Chloe retreated down the hall. Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had hoped for a miracle, but now even that hope felt like a distant dream. 30 minutes later, the wail of sirens broke the silence of the night. Lisa's heart leapt and sank all at once. She listened as the officers knocked on the door, their voices muffled but authoritative. Zayden greeted them as if they were old friends. "Officers," he said, flashing a practiced smile. "Is there a problem? We received a call from this address. A young girl reported she was in danger," one of the officers stated, his eyes narrowing slightly as he peered past Zayden into the house. Zayden's laugh was light, almost dismissive. "Ah, that must have been my daughter. Lisa's going through a rough patch, teenage years, you know. She's been acting out a lot lately. Tonight she was upset because I wouldn't let her go out with her friends. You can imagine how teenagers can be." Chloe appeared beside him, her demeanor soft and accommodating. "Lisa's a good girl," she added, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "She just needs some time to settle down. We only want what's best for her." The officers exchanged glances before one of them called out, "Lisa, could you come here for a moment?" Lisa stepped into the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling at her sides. She felt the weight of Zayden's stare on her back as she met the officer's eyes. The man, older and visibly tired, softened his expression. "Hey there," he said gently. "Are you okay?" Lisa hesitated. Her mouth opened, but the words caught in her throat. Zayden's presence loomed over her, a silent threat. "She's fine," Zayden interjected smoothly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Just a little emotional tonight. Right, sweetheart?" Lisa nodded weakly, her gaze fixed on the floor. The officer sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I have a daughter around her age," he said, turning to Zayden. "They can be a handful. Mine once snuck into the station to steal a taser just to prove a point." "Kids, right?" Zayden chuckled, playing along. Exactly. You understand. Just keep an eye on her, the officer said, patting Zayden on the shoulder. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call us. As the officers left, Lisa stood frozen in the doorway, her chest heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. When the door clicked shut, she knew the real nightmare was about to begin. The moment the police cruiser disappeared down the street, Zayden slammed the front door shut with a force that shook the house. His calm facade cracked like fragile glass. In a flurry of anger, he strode to the kitchen, yanked a bottle of whiskey from the fridge, and drank deeply. He hurled the empty bottle to the floor, where it shattered into jagged pieces, glinting like his sharp, narrowed eyes. "Lisa!" His voice boomed, echoing off the walls. The girl froze where she stood, her small frame trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. He didn't wait for her to move. With iron-like hands, he gripped her arm and dragged her toward her bedroom. "You think you're clever, huh? Calling the cops on your own father?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You ungrateful little—" The rest of his words dissolved into a barrage of insults as he shoved her into the room and locked the door behind them. Downstairs, Chloe crouched in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she reached for a broom to clean up the broken glass. Her fingers grazed a shard, and a thin line of blood bloomed on her palm. She winced, but said nothing. Her heart raced as the muffled sound of Lisa's cries seeped through the ceiling above her. The cries turned to screams, desperate, made Chloe's breath hitch in her chest. She pressed her hands together, blood dripping down her wrist as she whispered a hurried prayer by Spanish. "Dios mío, por favor, ayúdala." For a brief moment, something stirred in her. A voice, faint and persistent, whispered deep within her mind. "Save her." Chloe stood, her legs trembling. She moved toward the staircase, but before she could take the first step, Joel appeared. "Mom," he said, his tone steady, almost emotionless. He placed a firm hand on her arm, holding her back. "Don't." Chloe looked at her son, his face calm, but his grip unyielding. "Joel, Just turn on some music and go to bed," he interrupted, his words sharp and final. "I'll clean up this mess. Forget what you heard. It's not worth it." Chloe hesitated. Her lips parted as if to protest, but the weight of her son's gaze silenced her. She nodded weakly, retreating back to the kitchen as Joel bent to sweep up the broken shards. When Zayden finally left Lisa's room, the girl was crumpled on the bed like a discarded doll. She clutched a worn photograph to her chest, her thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The image in the photo, a woman with warm eyes, a young boy with a gap-toothed smile, and a younger version of Lisa herself, blurred as tears filled her eyes. Her mind drifted to a time when life had been different. She remembered the day in court, the sound of her mother's voice breaking as she promised to come back for her. "I'll never leave you, honey," her mother had said, tears streaming down her face. But 2 years later, her father had coldly delivered the news. Her mother was gone. "A car accident," he said. No details, no closure, just the end of a hope Lisa had clung to with all her might. Her brother Leo was sent to live with their grandmother in Canada. Lisa had begged to visit them, to see the only family she had left, but Zayden's temper flared at every request. "No!" he would shout, his fists slamming the table. "You belong here, under my roof. Forget them." She tried, but forgetting was impossible. Chloe's face flickered in Lisa's mind, a woman who had stepped into their lives not long after her mother's death. Chloe, with her soft Mexican accent and quiet ways, had seemed like a source of warmth at first, but the warmth had turned cold. Lisa had come to see Chloe not as a mother, but as a ghost, a woman who moved through the house like a shadow, cleaning, cooking, obeying Zayden's every word, without question. Chloe had dreams once. Lisa knew that much. She'd overheard snippets of conversations, talk of a life in America, better opportunities for her son, Joel. But those dreams had withered under Zayden's control. Chloe, too, bore the scars of his rage, though she never spoke of them. Lisa wondered if Chloe had ever thought about leaving, about taking Joel and running far away. But Chloe stayed, her silence a bitter reminder of what fear could do to a person. And so Lisa lay there, her tears soaking the photograph in her hands. In the dim light of her room, she whispered to the faces in the photo, "I'll find a way out. I promise." Lisa tiptoed down the creaking stairs, the faint chill of the basement brushing against her skin. It was late, and the house above was silent save for the muffled hum of Chloe's television. The dim light from a single bulb swung gently. She didn't mind the eerie stillness. Down here she could feel closer to her mother. She knelt on the cold floor, her fingers trembling as she sifted through boxes and forgotten trinkets. Each object she touched was a fleeting glimpse into the past. A scarf that still carried a faint trace of her mother's perfume. A photograph from a birthday long ago. But it wasn't enough. Her hand brushed against something solid beneath a loose wooden plank. Curious, she pried it open, revealing a small, battered metal box. Its surface was scratched and rusted, as if it had been hidden for years. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened it. Inside were neatly folded letters, faded photographs, and a few fragile sheets of medical records. She unfolded the first letter, her mother's familiar handwriting sprawling across the page. Maria's voice seemed to echo in the quiet basement as Lisa read, her heart sinking with every word. Maria had written about the nights she endured Zayden's violence, the moments she felt her body break under his fury. There were words of love for Lisa and her brother, promises to shield them no matter the cost. Lisa's trembling hand reached for the medical records. The sterile print on the paper told a chilling story. Broken ribs, internal bleeding, a miscarriage. Her mother had suffered far worse than she had ever known, and all the while Zayden had controlled the narrative, painting Maria as unstable and unreliable. Tears blurred her vision as she rifled through more letters. One bore a postal stamp that froze her in place. Alaska. It wasn't Canada, as her father had always claimed. Her grandmother wasn't living a mere country away. She was in Alaska, a place Zayden had never once mentioned. Lisa stared at the letter, its address smeared and illegible. But the implications were clear. He had lied. He had kept her grandmother and brother far out of reach, severing the only real ties she might have had to family. A mixture of rage and heartbreak surged within her. Later that night, Lisa sat across from Chloe at the kitchen table. The metal box sat between them, its contents spilling out like evidence from a courtroom. Chloe avoided Lisa's gaze, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You knew," Lisa said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You had to know what he was doing, to my mum, to me, and you stayed." Chloe's eyes darted toward the pile of letters, but didn't linger. "I didn't know about this," she said softly, her tone defensive. "It's not my place to dig into the past. My focus is on Joel. I can't afford to lose him." Lisa's frustration boiled over. "This isn't about you or Joel. Don't you see? He'll do the same to you. He already has. If you don't stand up to him, you'll end up like my mom." Chloe's expression hardened. "Stop it," she snapped. "You don't understand. I'm doing what I can to keep my family together. You're not the only one who's afraid of him. This isn't a family, Lisa said bitterly. Her voice cracked as she rose from her seat, leaving the letters strewn across the table. As Lisa turned to leave, Joel appeared in the doorway, his arms crossed and his face darkened with anger. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "I'm trying to talk to your mother," Lisa replied, her own anger flaring. "Not that you'd understand." "Understand?" Joel laughed bitterly, his tone cold and detached. "You think I don't see what's going on here? This whole house is a joke. You, me, her, none of us are a real family. The only reason we're even here is because of that damn green card." "Joel!" Chloe gasped, rushing to her son's side. She grabbed his arm, her grip desperate, but he shrugged her off. Lisa froze, her breath hitching. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud left a bitter taste in her mouth. She looked at Chloe, whose expression had crumbled into panic and shame, and then back at Joel. "I knew it," Lisa said, her voice cold. She glanced at Chloe one last time, her disappointment etched deeply in her features. Without another word, she walked out of the house, leaving the tension behind her like a storm she refused to weather any longer. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood, though its comfort felt distant to Lisa. Her steps were hesitant as she made her way to the small house at the end of the street. The house belonged to Susan, a widow in her 60s whose gentle demeanor had always been a source of quiet reassurance. Each time Lisa passed her home, Susan would wave or offer a kind word. It was that kindness, Lisa hoped, that might help her now. Knocking lightly on the worn wooden door, Lisa's heart raced. It felt like a betrayal of the fragile balance she had maintained at home. The door creaked open, revealing Susan's kind face framed by short, silver hair. "Lisa," Susan's brow furrowed with concern. "What brings you here, dear?" The words tumbled out before Lisa could stop herself. "I need your help. I don't have anyone else to turn to." Susan motioned her inside, her soft cardigan brushing against Lisa's arm as she closed the door. In the cozy living room, Lisa handed over the letters she had found, her mother's words from years ago, written with hope but stained with sorrow. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she read, her face growing pale. "My God, Lisa," she murmured, setting the papers down carefully on the table. "I believe you." Her voice carried both shock and resolve. Lisa felt the tension in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. "I don't know what to do. He'll find out if I try to leave. He always does." Susan reached across the table and took Lisa's hand. "We'll figure this out together. You're not alone anymore." Over the next few days, Susan proved to be more than just a sympathetic ear. Despite the challenges of tracking someone with only a name, Susan used her old contacts to verify Maria Harper's address in Alaska. She made calls and combed through old directories, her persistence unshaken. "Maria Harper," Susan said one evening, looking up from her notes with a satisfied smile. "She's your grandmother, isn't she? Lives in Anchorage. It took some digging, but I found her." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. It was the first real connection to her family she had felt in years. Susan also took the precaution of hiding Lisa's letters and documents in a safe place within her home. "If Zayden comes snooping," she said, sliding the folder under her sofa, "he won't find these. And if anything happens, you call me, you hear?" Being with Susan brought Lisa a sense of safety she hadn't known in a long time. Susan's home was warm and inviting, filled with soft lighting and the faint scent of lavender. For the first time in years, Lisa felt a flicker of hope. "You could talk to a social worker," Susan suggested gently one evening. With these letters, they might be able to help you get away from him. Lisa hesitated but nodded. The idea terrified her, but Susan's steady voice made it seem possible. Unfortunately, Xaden wasn't oblivious to Lisa's newfound confidence. He noticed her frequent trips to Susan's house and grew suspicious. One afternoon, he followed her and stood outside the window, his sharp ears catching fragments of conversation. "I promise, Lisa," Susan was saying. "I'll protect you, no matter what." The door flew open with a force that made Susan jump. Xaden stormed in, his eyes blazing with fury. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Lisa shrank back, but Susan stood her ground. As Xaden grabbed Lisa by the arm, Susan quickly slid the hidden documents further beneath the sofa with her foot. "Let go of her," Susan said firmly. Xaden's grip tightened. "Stay out of my family's business, old woman. This doesn't concern you." Susan's voice didn't waver. "I've lived long enough to know when someone's hiding behind threats. You don't scare me." Her words were calm, but they hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at Xaden's feet. He sneered but released Lisa, dragging her out of the house with one last glare at Susan. A week later, tragedy struck. Susan was driving to the grocery store when her car's brakes failed. The vehicle skidded into a ditch, leaving her shaken and injured. The accident was minor, but Lisa couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that it wasn't an accident at all. In the hospital, Susan lay pale but resolute. "Don't let this stop you, Lisa," she said, her voice faint but steady. "You deserve better than this. Promise me you won't give up." Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she nodded. "I promise." The accident, though small, was a chilling reminder of Xaden's reach. But instead of breaking Lisa's spirit, it steeled her resolve. She would find her grandmother, escape this nightmare, and expose Xaden for who he truly was. The house was steeped in silence, a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to cling to every corner. Lisa sat huddled on the floor of the living room, her frail body trembling from the blows that Xaden had unleashed on her only moments before. The faint outline of his handprint marked her arm, but it was the weight of his words that bore down on her soul. "If you think you can defy me, think again," he hissed. "The only way you leave this house is over my dead body." Lisa didn't cry openly, not while he was watching. Her tears were silent, sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the frame. Across the room, Chloe stood by the kitchen counter, her hands gripping the edge as though it might keep her upright. Joel leaned casually against the doorframe, his face unreadable, a faint sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. No one said a word. That night, Lisa lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her chest aching with the dull throb of bruises, both visible and unseen. The house had gone quiet, but she could hear faint creaks as Joel moved about the hall. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep. The door opened softly. Lisa's heart froze as Joel stepped inside, the glow from the hallway casting his shadow long and dark across the room. He closed the door behind him with deliberate slowness, his lips curving into a thin, disarming smile. "Lisa," he whispered, his voice gentle, almost kind. "I wanted to check on you. I know it's been a rough night." She didn't answer, her body tense as she watched him approach. He crouched beside the bed, his eyes glinting with something that made her stomach churn. "I know it's hard living here," he continued, his tone soothing. "You can trust me. I'm on your side." Lisa's grip on her blanket loosened slightly. For a moment his words felt genuine and her guard faltered. That was when his hand moved, resting on her arm in a way that was neither comforting nor welcome. "Stop," Lisa whispered, pulling back. Joel's smile widened, his grip tightening as he leaned closer. "Don't be like that," he murmured. Panic surged through Lisa, and she shoved him hard, her voice trembling as she yelled, "Get out!" The door flew open, and Chloe stormed in, her face pale with fury. "Joel!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. Joel staggered back, startled. Chloe didn't hesitate. She struck him hard across the face, the sharp crack of her palm echoing in the room. "How dare you!" she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Leave her alone." Joel, clutching his cheek, muttered something under his breath before retreating quickly. The door slammed behind him, leaving Chloe and Lisa in the tense stillness that followed. Chloe turned to Lisa, her expression softening as she knelt beside her. Lisa was trembling, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her blanket like a lifeline. "I'm so sorry," Chloe whispered, her voice breaking. She reached out but hesitated, unsure if her touch would be welcomed. Lisa didn't move away, but her sobs came harder, her small body racked with the weight of the evening's events. Chloe sank to the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wish I could protect you," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the worn carpet. "But I can't. Zayden, he'll throw us out. He's threatened to send Joel and me back to Mexico if I step out of line. And I can't let that happen to my son." Lisa's cries softened, her breathing ragged as she looked at Chloe with a mix of disbelief and pity. "You're scared of him too," she said, her voice barely audible. Chloe nodded, tears glistening in her own eyes. "Every day," she admitted. "I hate myself for it, for not doing more, for letting him hurt you." For the first time, Lisa saw not just the distant, detached stepmother she had resented for years, but a woman trapped and powerless, much like herself. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding, a fragile thread that connected their pain. "Thank you," Lisa whispered after a long silence. Chloe managed a weak smile, brushing a strand of hair from Lisa's face. "You don't need to thank me. I should have done this long ago." As they sat together in the quiet of the room, the gulf that had separated them began to close, piece by fragile piece. For the first time, Lisa felt she wasn't entirely alone. The day Jackson arrived, it was as if the grey clouds that had hung over Lisa's world finally began to part. She had been sitting in her math class, her mind wandering as usual, when a staff member entered and whispered something to the teacher. Moments later, Lisa was called to the office. Her heart sank. Being summoned was never good. She assumed Zayden had sent for her, perhaps another fabricated excuse to pull her out of school early. But as she shuffled toward the administrative office, she saw a tall, composed man waiting by the desk. "Lisa." His voice was firm but warm, his expression steady but not unkind. She hesitated, her thin frame almost retreating into itself. The secretary introduced him. "This is Mr. Jackson Callahan. He'd like to speak with you." Lisa blinked, her unease not fully abating. "Who?" "I'm Susan's son," he explained, gently extending his hand. "Your neighbor, Susan. My mum told me everything. I'm here to help." Help? The word felt foreign, almost unreal. Lisa stared at his outstretched hand for a moment before she finally accepted it with a timid shake. In the privacy of a small conference room, Jackson listened intently as Lisa recounted her story. At first her words were halting, her voice a mere whisper. But Jackson's calm demeanor and careful questions drew her out. Bit by bit, she told him about Zayden's anger, the bruises, the locked doors, and the hopeless nights. She hesitated when mentioning Chloe and Joel, unsure of how much to reveal. Jackson didn't press. "Only tell me what you're comfortable sharing," he said. "I'm here to help you, not force you into anything." From her bag, Lisa produced the letters and photographs she had guarded so carefully. As Jackson sifted through them, his sharp eyes caught every detail, the dates on the letters, the fading ink, the emotion captured in the photographs. He nodded, his expression growing more resolute. "This is enough to start a case," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I can't promise it'll be quick or easy, but you have a strong foundation here. I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe and reunited with your grandmother and brother." For the first time in years, Lisa felt something stir inside her, a flicker of hope. Jackson began the legal process immediately. He filed preliminary documents to request a court review of Lisa's guardianship and opened a private investigation into Zayden's history. He explained every step of the process to Lisa in simple, patient terms, ensuring she understood what was happening and why. Lisa, who had grown accustomed to being overlooked and dismissed, found herself startled by his attention to detail and the genuine care in his approach. "You're not alone in this anymore," Jackson reminded her. "Whatever Zayden tries, we'll handle it together." But the path forward wasn't without its shadows. Each night, Lisa lay awake, fearful of what Zayden might do if he discovered her plans. His wrath was swift and unrelenting, and she knew he wouldn't hesitate to lash out if he suspected she was slipping from his grasp. Sensing her fear, Jackson reassured her. "Zayden thrives on making you feel powerless," he said one afternoon as they reviewed a document. "But you're stronger than you realize, and if he tries anything, I'll make sure the law is on your side." His words, simple and steady, gave her a sense of security she hadn't known in years. Slowly, Lisa began to change. Jackson's presence became a stabilizing force in her life, and she started to see him as the older brother she had never had. He didn't pity her or treat her like a fragile thing. Instead, he treated her like someone capable of fighting back, someone worth fighting for. She even allowed herself to smile occasionally, a hesitant, fleeting curve of the lips that Jackson always noticed but never remarked upon. His quiet encouragement and unwavering belief in her began to erode the walls she had built around herself. Still, the road ahead loomed long and uncertain. There were papers to file, hearings to attend, and a life to rebuild. But for the first time, Lisa felt that she wasn't walking that road alone. As she sat in her room one evening, tracing the edges of an old photograph, she found herself whispering softly to the image of her mother. "I think I'm going to be okay. I think I might find my way back to them." Jackson had given her a glimpse of a brighter world, a world where justice might prevail and hope, fragile as it was, could finally take root. The air in Jackson's small office was heavy with the weight of their shared mission. Lisa sat across from him, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. The girl's tired eyes betrayed both hope and fear. Jackson, calm and methodical, reviewed the papers spread before him one last time. "I've got it," he said quietly, a note of certainty in his voice. "Your grandmother, Harper. She's in Alaska, small town called Sterling." Lisa's breath hitched. "You found her?" Jackson nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "I did. But Lisa," he hesitated, "it's not going to be simple." Lisa interrupted, her voice firmer than he expected. "I just need to hear her, to know she's still there." Jackson didn't argue. Instead, he handed her the phone, dialed the number, and waited as the line connected. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was soft, fragile yet unmistakably kind. Lisa hesitated, her throat tightening. "Grandma, it's me, Lisa." There was a pause, the silence stretching unbearably long before the voice cracked. "Lisa, my sweet girl, is it really you?" Harper's words tumbled out, raw with emotion. "I thought I'd never hear your voice again." Lisa's tears came freely now. "Grandma, he hurt me. He wouldn't let me see you or Leo. I didn't know what to do." Harper's sobs echoed through the receiver. "I knew he'd taken you away, but I didn't know how to find you. After Maria." Her voice broke. "He moved, changed numbers. I tried everything, Lisa, but I couldn't." Lisa closed her eyes, the grief in her grandmother's voice cutting through her like a knife. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Harper whispered. "I wanted to come for you, but I'm too old. And Leo, he's still so little. We didn't have the means to search for you. I failed you." "No," Lisa said firmly, her voice trembling. "You didn't fail me. You're here now." Jackson gave Lisa space to process the call, stepping into the next room to make his own preparations. Meanwhile, Susan, the neighbor who had witnessed more than she cared to admit, was meeting with local law enforcement. "I've seen it with my own eyes," she said, her voice unwavering. "That man, Zayden, he's a monster. I've heard Lisa's cries, seen the marks. And the accident with my brakes? That wasn't a coincidence." The officers took notes, nodding solemnly as Susan recounted the details. Her testimony, combined with the evidence Jackson had gathered, painted a chilling portrait of Zayden's cruelty. "This is enough," one officer finally said. "We'll bring him in." The knock at the door came late in the evening. Zayden, who had spent the day nursing a bottle of whiskey, stumbled to answer it. Two uniformed officers stood on the porch, their faces grim. "Zayden Carter, you're under arrest," one of them announced, stepping forward to secure him in handcuffs. "What the hell is this?" Zayden spat, struggling against their grip. "Child abuse, assault, and attempted vehicular sabotage," the officer replied. "We have multiple witnesses and corroborating evidence." Zayden froze, his face twisting with fury. He turned to glare at Chloe, who stood trembling at the foot of the stairs. "You," he hissed, "you're behind this." Chloe shook her head, her hands clasped tightly against her chest. But Zayden wasn't done. "Fine," he sneered, his voice rising. "You want the truth? She's not even my real wife. She's here for a green card. Fake marriage, the whole thing." The officers exchanged glances, noting the new accusation. Chloe's face went pale, her legs buckling slightly. Joel, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward, his face taut with anger. "Dad, stop!" Joel snapped, his voice trembling. "You've done enough." Zayden didn't reply. He allowed himself to be led out, his expression a toxic mix of rage and defeat. Inside, the house was silent. Chloe sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of untouched tea. Joel hovered nearby, his usual detachment replaced by a tentative, protective energy. "I'll call Jackson," Lisa finally said. "He'll know what to do." Chloe nodded absently, her mind already racing through the implications of Zayden's outburst. Deportation. The end of everything she had fought to hold together. But even in her fear, a small voice whispered that perhaps, for Lisa, this was the beginning of something better. Jackson arrived soon after, his presence steadying the room. Lisa met him at the door, her expression a mixture of determination and weariness. "It's done," Jackson told her simply. Lisa nodded, but her eyes drifted to the window, where the moon hung high above the trees. Somewhere far away, her grandmother and brother were waiting. For the first time in years, Lisa dared to believe that soon she would be with them again. The courtroom hummed with a low, tense murmur. Zayden sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his face devoid of emotion, but his clenched fists betraying the fury simmering beneath. Across the room, Lisa sat quietly, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized chair. Chloe and Joel sat together, yet their silence spoke of separate worlds. Chloe's eyes darted nervously around the room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Joel's gaze remained fixed on the table, his jaw set in anger or shame. It was hard to tell. The charges against Zayden were read aloud. Child abuse, reckless endangerment in the incident with Susan, and marriage fraud. Each word landed like a stone in the heavy air, and Chloe seemed to shrink further into herself. Joel's shoulders tightened, his fingers drumming against his knee in an erratic rhythm. Lisa didn't move. Her thoughts drifted as the voices around her became muffled, background noise. She remembered Chloe's quiet kindness during her worst days, the way her stepmother would leave a glass of warm milk on her nightstand after one of Zayden's outbursts. It hadn't been much, but it had meant everything. And Joel, his sharp words and cold demeanor, had hidden a boy who was just as trapped as she was. The prosecutor began presenting evidence, photographs of Lisa's injuries, medical records from the hospital visits Susan had encouraged, and Chloe's immigration paperwork, which Zayden had weaponized against her. The defense countered weakly, but the truth hung in the room, undeniable and heavy. When the time came for witnesses, Lisa's name was called. For a moment, she froze. All eyes turned to her, and her heart raced. She glanced at Chloe, who wouldn't meet her gaze, and at Joel, who seemed more fragile than she had ever seen him. Slowly, she stood. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way to the stand. Sitting down, she took a deep breath, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of the witness box. "Lisa," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your father's relationship with Chloe?" There was a pause. Lisa's voice was quiet at first, trembling but steady. "It was real," she said, her words causing a ripple of surprise across the room. Zayden's eyebrows shot up, and Chloe gasped audibly. Joel shifted in his seat, his eyes wide with confusion. "Can you elaborate?" the prosecutor prompted. Lisa nodded. "After my mum died, my dad was lost. He drank a lot and he was angry all the time. Then Chloe came into our lives. At first, she made things better. She cared about him, about me." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "They got married because they loved each other. It wasn't fake. But then—" She paused, gathering her courage. "Then my dad started drinking again. He became violent. He used Chloe and Joel's immigration status to control them. He threatened to send them back to Mexico whenever he didn't get his way." The prosecutor nodded. "And how did Chloe respond to this treatment?" Lisa glanced at Chloe, whose face was streaked with tears. "She tried to protect me. In her own way, she did what she could. But she was scared. She didn't know how to fight him." When Lisa finished, the silence in the room was deafening. She stepped down, her legs shaky, but her resolve unbroken. Joel stood next. His initial reluctance gave way as he spoke, his voice raw and uneven. "My mom. She deserved better," he admitted, his eyes meeting Lisa's for the first time. "I was angry, but I was wrong. I didn't stand up for her or for Lisa, and I'm sorry." He described Zayden's manipulation in detail, exposing the man who had tried so hard to maintain his facade. His testimony brought murmurs of agreement from the jury. When the defense rested, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. The judge delivered the verdict with firm finality. Guilty on all counts. Xaden was sentenced to 5 years in prison, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing as he was led away. Chloe's immigration status was put on hold, granting her the chance to remain in the country while her case was reviewed. Lisa's guardianship was transferred to her grandmother in Alaska. The courthouse was silent now, its echoing halls a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had filled them hours earlier. Lisa stood by the steps, the cool evening air brushing against her face as she watched Chloe approach. Chloe's face was pale, her eyes shadowed with years of worry and regret. "I don't even know where to begin," Chloe started, her voice trembling. She wrung her hands, a nervous habit Lisa had come to recognize. "Lisa, I owe you more than a thank you. You stood up for me when I didn't have the courage to stand up for myself." Lisa looked at her stepmother, the years of tension and misunderstanding between them flashing in her mind. "You didn't deserve what he put you through," Lisa said softly. Chloe's eyes filled with tears. "Neither did you. I let fear rule me. I thought staying silent would protect Joel, but I see now it only hurt us all. I'm so sorry." She hesitated before reaching into her worn handbag, pulling out a small envelope. "It's not much, just what I've saved over the years. Use it to start fresh." Lisa hesitated, staring at the envelope. She wanted to refuse, but Chloe's earnest expression stopped her. She accepted it with a nod, her fingers brushing against Chloe's. Later that evening, Joel found her sitting in the kitchen, staring at the photograph she always carried. He paused at the doorway, his tall frame awkward and unsure. "Can I sit?" he asked. Lisa glanced up. She could see the weight he carried in the lines of his face. She nodded, and he pulled out a chair, sitting across from her. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry," Joel began, his voice low and steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what I let happen. I didn't protect you, and that was wrong." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I thought ignoring it made it easier, but it didn't. It just made me a coward." Lisa studied him for a moment. "Joel, I accept your apology. You'll be better in the future." He nodded, his expression earnest. "I will." A small smile tugged at Lisa's lips. "Then start by helping Mom. She needs someone to lean on." Joel's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a burden had been lifted. "I will," he promised. "Thank you, Lisa." The day of her departure came quickly. Susan and Jackson stood with her at the terminal, their faces etched with pride and sadness. Susan enveloped Lisa in a warm hug. "You've been so brave, sweetheart. Your mother would be so proud of you." Lisa held on tightly, tears pricking her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you too." Jackson stepped forward, his strong, steady presence reassuring. "Remember, Lisa, you're not alone. If you ever need anything, you call me. Promise?" "I promise," Lisa replied, her voice thick with emotion. As she boarded the plane, she glanced back one last time. Susan waved, her smile unwavering, while Jackson gave her a small nod of encouragement. Lisa clutched her bag and stepped onto the plane, her heart heavy but hopeful. The flight was smooth, the hum of the engines lulling her into a rare moment of peace. She gazed out the window, watching as the clouds drifted beneath her. The sunlight broke through, painting the sky with golden hues. She thought of her mother, the memories now less painful and more like a guide. "I'll make you proud, Mom. she whispered, her hand resting on the photo, tucked safely in her pocket. She imagined the embrace of her grandmother, the voice of her brother calling her name. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. When the plane landed, Lisa's heart raced. She walked through the bustling terminal, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on two familiar figures. Bar Harper stood there, her small frame radiating warmth despite her years. Beside her was Leo, his boyish grin wide and inviting. The moment they saw Lisa, their faces lit up with joy. Lisa felt her steps quicken, her legs carrying her toward them as if they had a mind of their own. Bar Harper opened her arms, and Lisa collapsed into the embrace, the scent of lavender and home filling her senses. "My sweet girl," Bar Harper murmured, her voice choked with emotion. Leo tugged at Lisa's sleeve, his laughter bubbling up. "You're finally here, sis." Lisa smiled through her tears, pulling him close. The pain of the past lingered but no longer consumed her. This was her new beginning. As they walked out of the airport, the late afternoon sun bathed them in light. Lisa glanced back at the clouds one last time, then turned her face to the warmth ahead. Thank you for joining me on Lisa's journey, a story of pain, resilience, forgiveness, and hope. It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a path to healing and new beginnings. If Lisa's story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Let's keep these important conversations alive. And remember, every ending is just a new chapter waiting to be written. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll dive into more stories that matter. Until then, take care, stay strong, and keep believing in better days ahead. See you soon.